Good evening, everyone. It is truly an honor and a privilege to welcome you to the Academy of Jewish Thought and Learning in the virtual space. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I know people will be coming in. Certainly for those of us who are South Africans, load shedding and reconnecting up with signals and things is a thing. So we're just going to start off slowly, and hopefully people will join us as they can. So firstly, I'd like to just welcome our two guests briefly before beginning with a little bit about the Academy and then going into our discussion. So I just want to welcome Reverend Peter Houston and Rabbi Yonatan Neril. It is an absolute joy and honor to have you here with me and to be able to have this conversation, which I think is a long time in coming and is really just the beginning of many conversations. So thank you very much for taking time out of your days and coming to join us for this. So on that note, let us just begin with a basic introduction into the Academy, just so we understand where we were. Some of you may be a little new to the space. So the Academy space is basically defined by Torah or Bible, by our ethos, by our thirst to learn, our desire to learn from other people, our appreciation of nuance and complexity, our desire to learn things we don't already think, our desire for anyone to ask any question respectfully, and our mutual respect and reverence for our space. And that is really how our space is defined. And so therefore we welcome you and we hope that you'll join us. And of course, then feel free to participate. Turn on your video, please, if you can, obviously load shedding willing. And you can ask any question on the chat or raise your hand, and there will be a recording and notes that will be emailed to you after the session. So that's where we're up to. In terms of how we got to this, before we do that, let's just take a look how the session is going to look. We're going to start with a little bit of an introduction, define what interfaith is, look at our common past, talk about a phenomenon called Earthrise, and then talk about Tishrei, the Hebrew month of Tishrei, which takes place at the same time as the English month of September, and then finally conclude with talking about a common future. And that's really where we're going to go. So in terms of this, really where we began was when we decided we'd like to have a conversation about what interfaith is, about how it brings together, or how it can bring people together rather than split them apart. And when we were talking about a date for this, what came to mind, and Peter raised this, was that it's September 11th today. And as we know, that's 21 years. I'm sure people have seen that there've been obviously memorials, etc. It's 21 years since the events, the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And so really this brings up the idea very naturally, I think, which is it brings into question, I guess, the role of religion, the problem of its ability to polarize, perhaps. How do we balance tolerance with and yet have different beliefs? These are some of the things that we really have been speaking about. So there's no one better, I think, anyway, who defines this and really spoke about this and thought about this so much as the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. So I just want to read you just a short quote from what is his latest book, which is called The Power of Ideas. In one of his speeches in 2008, he said as follows. He said, "The real question, which has echoed time and again through the corridors of history, is whether we can find ways of living together, despite the fact that we can't find ways of believing or worshiping together." That is what the Bible teaches in its very first chapter, when it says that we are all, every one of us, in the image of God. Our love of God must lead us to a love of humanity. I find it extraordinary that in an age in which globalization is forcing us together, all too often across the globe, faith is driving us apart. We should be fighting environmental destruction, political oppression, poverty, and disease, not fighting one another, least of all in the name of God, whose image we all bear. I think you'll all agree with me that that is a beautiful quote that sets, I hope, the tone of this discussion that we're going to have. So on that note, then, let's discuss what interfaith really is. And for this, I'm just going to spotlight our speakers. And where's Rabbi Yonatan? Over here, and spotlight. There we go. Now we have everyone. So what we would like to start with then is that I'm going to hand over at this point firstly to Rabbi Yonatan Neril, who runs the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development in Israel. I'm not going to tell you his biography because I'm actually going to let him tell you a little bit about himself, but also through doing so, he will also help to define what is interfaith and what it means to him. And then Reverend Peter, we will move over to you. So Rabbi Yonatan, if I can hand over to you.
Thank you, Ilana. It's great to be here with you this evening. I'm here in Jerusalem, and as Ilana mentioned, I founded and direct the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Developments. Part of my family came from Vilna about 120 years ago, and some of them moved to Johannesburg. For me, interfaith is about connecting with people of other faiths around the common cause of ecological sustainability. We're all on the same ship, we're all in this together, and it's not about us versus them, it's about us and them and how we find common cause. I like to say that the other is a brother of a different mother, sister of a different mister. And with the ecological challenges that we're facing in our times, it's really a question of how do we work together so that the next generation can inherit a thriving, sustainable, and spiritually aware planet.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much. Reverend Peter, will you take it away at this point?
So it's lovely to be here as well. I am a learner in the interfaith space, so I don't come with a world of experience in interfaith relations. I just come with a big learner number plate on my front. But I'm an Anglican priest. I was ordained back in 2008 into the Anglican Church. Before then, my background was hydrology and environmental management. So I actually started off working in an environmental, in an engineering firm in water supply and sanitation. And that was at the time of the September 11th attack. I remember I was very much out in the field looking at rural water supply. And it was one of those events where were you on September 11th? I remember I was looking in the southern KwaZulu-Natal, overlooking a very deeply rural area, and I had water matters on my mind 1 minute. Next minute, news of September 11th. And I was very struck by that with the violence of the act, but also the ripples that spread out from United States of America across the globe. And it was an act in the name of religion and a form of religious extremism. And I think that was a wake-up call for me. And I wasn't ordained minister then, so that was one of the things at the backdrop of my own journey. But the pitfalls and the danger of religious extremism, where we fail to see each other as people. And so I've been on this journey of just being curious about other people and other religions. And I did an online course through the Wolf Institute in Cambridge, UK. It was on Jewish-Muslim relations. I was the outsider in that space, and it was just fascinating learning of all these different perspectives on land and space, and learning. But that's informed then my approach, and just asking questions and seeking to hear stories.
Okay, fantastic. So on that then, let's take a look at the definition of interfaith, just to understand, because I have, well, it's actually thanks to Rabbi Yonatan that I've known a little bit more about interfaith, that's for sure, working a little bit with Rabbi Yonatan and representing the ICSD in South Africa at one point. So that it's easy, I guess, for me. But then I started thinking, well, what actually does interfaith mean? And so just to make sure that we're all understanding, really, this is from the Oxford English Dictionary. Interfaith is relating to or involving different religions or members of different religions, for example, using it as an adjective to encourage interfaith dialogue. So, pretty simple on one level, but what I found really interesting is that the dictionary also gives you the use over time of a word. And if you'll notice here, it's very, very low all the way along and starts sort of rising in around 1950s and hitting at a moment, I don't know if that would be September 11th of, what was it, 2001, but I do think it's really interesting that that's what happened to the word, what has happened to the word. So on that then, let's do an interfaith dialogue and continue with it as we go along. I'm going to go along, but please, Reverend Peter or Rabbi Yonatan, you'll jump in as well at any point. Should you need to, should you want to, besides actually talking, of course, at the various moments. So the first thing is to then understand what we have to talk about and what brings us together. Well, the first thing is pretty easy, and we've already seen it in Rabbi Sachs's comment, and that is that we do have a common past. And that comes to us all the way from Genesis, Bereshit, chapter 1, of course, the creation of the world, where we have, and God said, let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on the earth. And God created humankind in the divine image, creating it in the image of God, creating them male and female. And we all know this very well, but the point is that this is the source, certainly of the Abrahamic faiths, the source that says that we are all from one human being. And the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, in the Talmud, gives a couple of reasons as to why God would create a human being as an individual, as a singular level. And according to the Talmud, what we have here is that this was done due to the importance of maintaining peace among people, so that one person will not say to another, my father, i.e. my progenitor, is greater than your father. And this serves to tell of the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be he, as when a person stamps several coins with one seal, they are all similar to each other, but the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, stamped all people with the seal of Adam, the first human, as all of them are his offspring, and not one of them is similar to another. So on this note, and talking about our commonalities, Reverend Peter, I could ask you to perhaps talk to us about some of these sources, these quotes that I put up on the screen, or if you'd like to talk, and then I'll put them up afterwards.
Well, I'd rather defer to Rabbi Yonatan to talk about the archetypal human before we get into me pottering with Jewish sources. Not all that qualified to look at.
No
if
problem.
We could do it that way around.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I completely, slipped mine. Thank you. So Rabbi Yonatan, if you'll just talk to us about that archetypal human being.
Sure. So there's an idea in the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, known as Adam Kadmon, the primordial human being, and which the Jewish sages also say that Adam Olam Katan, that the human being is a miniature world, and which also I believe relates to the ecological crisis, because we think of global environmental issues like climate change and biodiversity loss and plastic pollution as these big global problems, but in fact they stem from the consumption of individual human beings times billions of people. And so the question is, what is going on within the human being in terms of how we're relating to creation, that when it plays out when it's in the aggregate, when we multiply it times millions and billions of people of that one archetype. And today, we can think of the average consumer who's consuming disposables or meat or flying. And when that has become the archetype of the human being, the typical human being, then we see what happens. Whereas by comparison, the original human being, which in the Genesis creation story was both male and female together, that it's this unity, and this the ideal was, as it says in Genesis chapter 2 verse 15, and God placed the human being in the garden to serve it and conserve it. So the original human was supposed to take care of creation and take care of the garden, and Rabbi Jonathan Sacks understood that as applying to all of humanity today.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you for that. Peter, Reverend. Yeah, just perhaps then, would you like to talk to those sources? Shall I put them up on the screen, or shall I?
I think if you put those verses up on the screen, the writing. So just to give a bit of a context to this, when I was doing the Wolf Institute course on Jewish-Muslim encounters, we were given little assignments, and one assignment was to discuss this conversation between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai about what is the greatest instruction or commandment or ethic to live by. And so we are just given a paragraph with their debate and told, go discuss in light of your own experience and your own religion. And I found it fascinating delving into it and trying to locate it within my own Christian experience. And I loved the tension that there was in the disagreement between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai. Rabbi Akiva saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is a great principle of the Torah. And Ben Azai disagreed the verse. This is the book of the descendants of Adam. When God created humankind, it was made in the likeness of God as a principle even greater. And that seems to characterize a number of rabbis. I'm not an expert, but they're just wonderful arguments and debates, and even a rabbi saying, I disagree with this, and then next moment turning around and saying, but I also agree. And some of that seems to carry through. So Akiva used to say, beloved is the human being, for it was created in the image of God. Especially beloved is he, for it was made known to him that he has been created in the image of God. As it said, for in the image of God he made humanity, or humans. And so it's not just being made in the image of God or the divine likeness, but having that conscious thought that we can actually contemplate our place in this world, in this universe. And if you go on to the next slide, to then see that there are links with my own Christian faith, because you have someone like Hillel, which is an ancient teacher. A Gentile comes to Hillel, asks the question, teach me all of this as quickly as you can. And he is a convert to Judaism. And Hillel says, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That's the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation. Go study. And we find within the teaching of Yeshua ben Yosef, or Jesus, the Anglican, not the Anglican form, the anglicized form, he teaches in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, in everything do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the Torah and the prophets. And so suddenly a teaching that I'm so familiar with, having heard sermons on it and multiple books, is actually located and connected to ancient Judaism, and there is an immediate bridge for me for conversation, but also linking back to the first Adam, that this great commandment to love one another is also situated in understanding our common humanity. And so I summed up my assignment by saying perhaps all these Jewish rabbis saw that the two principles, love your neighbor as yourself and being made in a divine image, are the flip side of the same coin. For you cannot truly love your neighbor if you do not recognize in yourself and in the other the connection with the divine image.
So I think that's wonderful. Between the two, the idea, I love the idea of the flip side, this idea, and that connects to the fact of having one person, one archetypal person, as Rabbi Yonatan said, that if we all are descended, as it were, from there, and we understand that it's all in the image of God, then being able to see the other as not the other, but merely as part of the archetype, I guess, and connected then very, very deeply. Okay, sorry, just checking the chat. Paula, I hope you were able to see the screen eventually. When I share again, let's just check. Let us know if not. So I think that fantastic. The lights are back on in Glen Hazel in Johannesburg. So that's very exciting. Okay, it is exciting. So on that then, and having sort of spoken a little bit, and really we're just taking tiny moments of discussion to take us on a certain path, but of course everything we can spend hours on, really. But we won't at this point. And so we will then take ourselves through to another moment. So going from our common past, coming to a really interesting moment in the history of the world, really. If we jump from the discussion in the Talmud, the discussion that Jesus brings up in Matthew, if we jump from there, which is 1,500 years or more or less, through a very difficult history, a history where relationships between Jews and Christians specifically is incredibly troubled. And in fact, then we get to the 1800s where the whole world becomes troubled because the Industrial Revolution occurs. And with that, indeed, humanity really begins to truly rule the earth in a way that causes immense consumption and immense changes of fossil fuels and all the other troubles that have led us to discuss things like climate change today. But there's a very interesting decade, which is the 1960s. And in the 1960s, certain things all coalesce and happen at one time, it seems. Just to name a few, in 1967, a woman, Rachel Carson, publishes a book called The Silent Spring, where she tells people, basically what she's telling in the book, amongst other things, and please correct me if I'm wrong, or if I haven't said enough here, but is that she analyzes the fact that DDT, which is a pesticide spray, and is used with gay abandon across every crop across the United States, causes, through a series of links, causes birds to lay eggs where the shells are very thin. And so they are not viable and they cannot hatch. Basically, they die. The birds themselves, the yolk, etc., just cannot develop, and so they die. And so she calls her book The Silent Spring, because what she says is that if we continue to do this, and we continue to pour poison into the world, eventually there will be a silent spring, because people will, the birds will no longer be there, and so they will not be chirping and will not be singing. That is one thing that happens that starts to bring to the attention the impact of our actions on the world. Interestingly enough, Charles Lynn White is a writer and writes in Science, in the journal called Science, again in 1967, where he talks about the environmental crisis, and he very much places its faults with what he calls the Judeo-Christian tradition, where he says that because we were told that we had to rule the earth, therefore it is because of us, and because we thought we could rule the earth, that the environment is suffering. And from that point on, indeed, for the next 15 to 20 years, there is very much a tension and argument between the environmental world and the religious world, even though eventually then things get better and people are allowed to be religious environmentalists or environmentally friendly religious people. But at this point, we're getting some of this kind of discussion that's coming up in the 1960s. The thing that really changed how we saw the world was this. I hope everyone can see it, but this picture is called Earthrise, and it was taken on Christmas Eve in 1968 by William Anders, who was one of the 3 astronauts on Apollo 8. So Apollo 8, everyone will remember, we were talking about the space race between Russia and America, and America sends into space the Apollo 8, which has three men on it, 3 astronauts, and it was the first mission that circled the moon, orbited the moon. And from the moon, William Anders takes this picture of the Earth. And it has become, and it's known throughout the world really, as the most influential environmental photograph ever taken. So I'm going to stop at this point and ask, and this is to anyone, why do you think this image had such an impact on people? Any thoughts from anyone? Shall I put it back on and let's look at it again? Why would this change the way people saw the world? I think we could practically say because it was the first time we saw the world this way. But what is this way? Yes.
I think it changed our perspective. We suddenly realized that we all inhabit one sphere, one planet, if you want, one Earth. And you only get that perspective from outer space.
100%. Thank you. Exactly that. We suddenly saw our world as a very small circle, fragile circle, circling through the vastness of space. And we're all on it. We're all sitting there on the same planet. Paula, I'm not really sure why you're struggling still. Yeah, maybe switch on and switch off again. So switch off and switch on again. Try that, see if that works for you. So that definitely changed the way people saw the world. All of a sudden, we're all on the same planet. We're all on the same boat, as Rabbi Yonatan said. And it became very, very clear. It was also beautiful. Suddenly we saw how beautiful our world looked from this very dead looking, you know, what you're seeing here at the bottom. This is the moon, right? Which is definitely not filled with plants and oceans and creatures galore. And suddenly we could see our planet for what it was. And that really made a huge difference. And what's so interesting is that the astronauts themselves definitely felt the same way, because that day, on that day, this is the broadcast that they sent through.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people.
I just want to find out if everyone could hear that.
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, thank you.
Back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
Sorry, just before we go to the next point, I think for me, certainly what was so beautiful was that there were these 3 men circling around in outer space, and the message they wanted to send to humanity was that of our common origin, and what they felt when they saw the world like that was what a beautiful world that was created. And they took themselves, they used the Bible as their first source, which I think is something that is not always the case with, you know, it's not always a natural thing, and yet they did. At least that's the way I see it. Reverend Peter, would you like to comment on that a little?
I would. I'm quite interested in the development of environmental thought and how it connects within Christianity, a theological thinking that was actually empowered because suddenly there was a language to give voice to concepts that were there of old. We have Christian heroes like Francis of Assisi, who's now like the icon and patron saint for the environment. So there was the ability to look at scriptures and see the need for caring for the world, but generally there wasn't the language. And with 1950s and 60s, the birth of environmental and wildlife management and environmental science, suddenly these connections began to be made. And I want to read from Elder Leopold in 1949 in the Sand County Almanac. He wrote this, that individual thinkers since the days of Ezekiel and Isaiah have asserted that the despoilation of land is not only inexpedient but wrong. Society, however, has not yet affirmed that belief. He then goes on to say, it cannot be right in the ecological sense for a farmer to canalize his creek or pasture his steep slopes, because in so doing he passes flood trouble to his neighbors below, just as his neighbors above have passed it on to him. That's the ancient ethic of loving your neighbor. But now we see the beginning of ecological language and the understanding of ecosystems, and everything's connected. And that's also what the Silent Spring brought to the fore. Here we have a pesticide being used for food and is harming our wildlife, and the feedback loops now throughout the ecosystem. But it's this Earthrise photo that I think has the motive power that really, within different religions, says we're on the same planet. So as Rabbi Yonatan says, we're in the same boat. And I'm fascinated that many astronauts and cosmonauts, having been up into space, what they comment on is how beautiful it is, how finite it is, how they can't see any divisions. Frank Borman, the commander of Apollo 8, said this: the view of the Earth from the moon fascinated me. A small disk 240,000 miles away, raging nationalistic interests, famines, wars, pestilence don't show that from that distance. I think the one overwhelming emotion that we had was when we saw the Earth rising in the distance over the lunar landscape. It makes us realize that we all do exist on one small globe. For from 230,000 miles away, it really is a small planet.
Beautiful.
And the Russian cosmonauts say the same thing, and from different countries, and it actually illustrates the point. Cosmonauts and astronauts, different places, different religions, looking back and going, oh, it's a small planet. We want humanity. From dust we came, from dust we shall return. We're all born of the stars, carbon life forms.
Fantastic. That's it. And in fact, there's a wonderful, I think, is it a BBC production or something, of different astronauts giving their points of view, and most of them, they all say how it changes their whole way of being just by being up there. And even though we're not up there, at least we have some of the imagery to help us along, I guess. But that does make it strengthens the idea, I guess, of the common origin, of the love that they really, of the fact that we're all neighbors, as you mentioned. Rabbi Yonatan, would you like to add here?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. This image in that recording is very moving, and this is what we need. Even though that image is from 1968, but this is what humanity needs, and we need to be constantly reminded of this message that we have one home. This is our home. This is our common home. We're in this together. Because when we zoom out and see the Earth from the moon, so we can see our interdependence, our interconnectedness, that we're all there. And that's what we need at this moment in history, as Russia and Ukraine, are at war, and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is under serious threat of having a nuclear explosion, which would affect all of Europe, but all of humanity and all species. and you know, it's sort of like we're kids in a sandbox, kids fighting in a sandbox, and yet we have nuclear weapons, or as one of my teachers, Dr. Peter Reverend, said, we have space age technology with stone age morality. And that's really the challenge for religion today is, you know, how can religion be a source of inspiration and of peace and coexistence? How can it, and sustainability? These are some of the key moments. Everything is at stake. We're living in times that our ancestors have been dreaming about for thousands of years. It all hangs in the balance. And we can see that from space, but can we see that when we look another human being in the eyes? Can we see the image of the divine in the other and see, you know, their humanity, their dignity, their light? That's the spiritual challenge for humanity today.
Absolutely. That really does sum it up. Thank you. And I guess then, you know, how do we do this? How do we find moments, perhaps? And I think that's where religion, ritual, the year through the eyes of a person of faith, there are moments in that year that maybe we find that are best suited to remind ourselves of these things. And that's really where I think it's so fascinating that at this time of the year, exactly where we are at the moment, we sit in we're in the month of Elul in the Hebrew months, and going to be going into Tishrei, which of course begins on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And we are taught that in the tractate, in the Talmud, that Rabbi Eliezer said the world was created in Tishrei. We have a tradition. There is another tradition that it was created in Nisan around Passover, but this is the one tradition that we're going to look at here, which is that the world was created at this time of year. So actually, Rabbi Yonatan, if you'll just talk to us perhaps a little bit about that, about Tishrei itself as this moment of creation, birth of the earth, environmental repentance, all that.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. It's, you know, sometimes people ask, well, how could it be that the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, takes place in the month of Tishrei, which is the 7th month of the year, according to the other counts? The view that believes that the birthday is the New Year begins in the month of Nisan, which is 6 months prior. And because the Torah records that the month of Tishrei is the 7th month. And so some of the rabbis answer that, well, because we can only have the new year once we've reached the level of 7. Because the physical world has 6 dimensions, there's 6 sides to a cube, and the inner dimension is the 7th dimension. And so Rosh Hashanah, even though it represents 1 in the beginning and the birthday of creation, the day when God created humanity and land species, but it also at some level represents the aspect of 7. And the aspect of 7 is such an important aspect for us, to rest 1 day a week, to take 1 day a year as the sabbatical year, as has been the case in Israel this past year. Because as Rabbi Sachs points out, the cycle of 7 is in the DNA of creation. The first verse of the Torah has 7 words, the next verse has 14 words. The cycle of 7 keeps reappearing. And when we disregard that cycle of 7, then we get out of balance. And if we're constantly using cell phones and internet and technology without stop, and so our being in balance with Earth requires that we respect these natural laws that God placed, these spiritual laws, and one of them is to connect to the cycle of 7.
Great. And of course, part of this time of the year is this idea of introspection, of repentance, coming up to Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. And I think what has arisen over the last few years that I've seen anyway is this idea of not just looking at ourselves and introspecting in ourselves as our own personalities in terms of what kind of a person have I been, you know, true to myself? Have I been good to others? You know, have I been connecting with God, with others, etc.? But also looking at who am I as an Earth citizen, and have I been true to? Have I, you know, been the kind of person that can appreciate God's creation and live here and do what we say in Genesis 2:15, which is to make use of the world, but also to protect it as something very precious. Rabbi Yonatan, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of environmental teshuvah?
Yes, so environmental teshuvah, environmental repentance. My organization is actually planning to organize an event on Jebel Musa, which is a mountain in the Sinai that Muslims and Christians consider to be Mount Sinai, where I went to a few weeks ago. Because this year Egypt is hosting the UN Climate Conference as the representative of Africa, even though they're actually holding it in the Sinai, which is outside of Africa, but because Egypt is in North Africa, so it still counts. And so as part of relating to the UN Climate Conference, we're planning to organize an interfaith climate repentance ceremony of world religious leaders coming together to say, look, we need to change our ways. You know, the spiritual roots of the ecological crisis are greed, apathy, short-term thinking, and finding our pleasure satisfaction in the physical. And the tshuva that we can do, the return, is to address those spiritual roots with spiritual solutions. And those spiritual solutions include humility, long-term thinking, and finding our pleasure satisfaction in family, community, and spirituality. So, you know, there's a lot of ecological tshuva that can be done. We can also be a reducitarian, reduce the amount of meat and dairy and eggs that we consume, or embrace a plant-based diet. We can reduce the amount of travel that we do, reduce our use of disposable, single-use products. There's so many ways to do ecological tshuva. And that I believe that, you know, Rav Kook talked 100 years ago about physical tshuva, the importance of, you know, of essentially being in our bodies. And in our times, I think it's appropriate to talk about ecological tshuva.
Absolutely. So hopefully we get that message out. Really interesting. Peter, Reverend Peter, if we could talk about the what is the moment in September that is important on the Christian calendar?
Well, it's interesting that the Christian calendar, the season of creation, is September, and it has its roots in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which went to according to a different calendar to the Western Church and the Roman Catholic Church, which adopted a different approach. And Eastern Orthodox calendar, I think, drew from, borrowed, mimicked, appropriated the Jewish pattern of when the new year was. And so the liturgical calendar in the Orthodox Church starts in September, and in the Roman Catholic churches and the Protestant churches that came out of that, actually only in Advent, which is at the end of November. But some years ago, coming out of the Orthodox Church, the ecumenical patriarch Demetrios in 1989 from the Orthodox Church proclaimed September as the season of creation. And this really caught on through the Christian ecumenical movement, and other churches adopted the same pattern, and the Roman Catholic Church came on board and extended it to include the first weekend in October, which is when St. Francis of Assisi is honored. And so it's actually become the whole of September, culminating with that weekend. And liturgies are put out and special prayers, and every year there's a different theme. So this year in the Anglican Church is about Ubuntu, that we are one, you know, our interconnectedness. Ecumenically, there's about hearing voices, not hearing voices that isn't in your head, but you know, giving space for different voices. And then there are challenges that go with that of environmental activism. So don't just speak it, act on it. So encouragement for church communities to have different projects and engage in environmental justice and environmental cleanups and environmental best practice. So it's multi-layered, but it runs throughout the whole of September.
Amazing. So also, I find it so fascinating that, as I like to say, there are no coincidences, but there are coincidences. So the fact that it is at the same time and how that happened doesn't really matter, I guess. But perhaps there's this energy, we could say, that's in the world, that's there spiritually, amongst people of faith that are building on that energy in order to make the world a better place, environmentally, ecologically speaking, and also, of course, in terms of understanding that all people are in the image of God, but all things are loved by God. After all, the whole of the first chapter of Genesis has God looking at this beautiful world and seeing that it is very good. And so I guess that really can hopefully be an impetus, let's say, in whether it's in Tishrei, September, that it actually can come together. And so really, I think we've looked at our common past. We've looked at the present and the fact that we are on one fragile, beautiful planet, that we are all actually in the image of God, and different and yet together. And I think that's in answering that question that we really asked at the very beginning, which is there may be things that set us apart, but there's perhaps more things that draw us together. And particularly in the environmental space and in the space of being Earth citizens, of being creatures on this planet who were created. And so I guess now it's about, well, what, where to in the future, or where from now and into the future, where is religion something that can help with the environmental crisis, in terms of religious actors? And Rabbi Yonatan, I know you were involved, and I don't know if I can't remember present, but certainly involved with COP26, which was the climate change conference last year in November. And so maybe, what was religion present there, or people of faith? And if so, how? What could they do?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, people of faith definitely were present there, and it was, if you look back at the COPs, going all the way back to the first COP in 1992 in Rio, the presence of faith-based organizations and religious figures and clergy has increased significantly, such that there's now a liaison committee, an interfaith liaison committee, and the World Council of Churches is a co-chair of that committee, and that is organizing a range of interfaith activities. In addition to what I mentioned that we're planning on Mount Sinai, we're also planning to hold an interfaith climate prayer at the Israeli exhibition in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, in November, and to bring together religious figures from 7 different faiths and religions, and to do an event at the Israeli exhibition in Sharm el-Sheikh. And this will be one of many faith-based climate and ecological initiatives that will take place during the UN Climate Conference this year.
That's great. And I guess that's just an ongoing thing, and trying to bring it really to both individuals' attentions and, of course, government attention, which is part of the case. Reverend Peter, in terms of maybe South Africa, Ubuntu, is there also something that we can do here, that bringing those two things together, that you're seeing or that you've been involved with?
I think that there are multiple initiatives in different spaces and across different church denominations. I can't speak for the Jewish space or denominations, but I'm connected with Benji Schulman, and every now and then he invites me to some online seminar on water or whatever. So there's certainly a lot of interest in activism, and I met with Clive Lipschin from Israel, who's got expertise in water, and that's where my personal interest lies. So there seems to be interactions between Christianity and Judaism, and around issues that we hold to be important, such as water scarcity, water treatment. I mean, our municipalities are falling apart, our rivers are polluted. I live down in Durban, well, Kloof near Durban. Our beaches have been closed because of raw sewage going out directly into our rivers and into the oceans because of lack of maintenance, and the list goes on. These are things that concern us all, as society, as environment, as different religious people. And so I think that's also the bridge. It's coming back to Rabbi Yonatan's opening thing. We are in the same boat, which is this one planet Earth.
Absolutely. I think, and you brought up when Clive Lipshin actually came here. So that was at the behest of, if I'm not mistaken, the Tshwane or Pretoria municipality. And what was fascinating for me is that, as many people know, South Africa, certainly its government and some of its people, have a difficult relationship with the state of Israel and with the existence of the state of Israel. And so this was something where instead of condemning Israel for whatever and sort of fighting against it, which is something that we do see as well, but in this case, with perhaps such huge challenges, there has been a rapprochement, interestingly enough, where people are saying, you know, we need to change things, we need help. This is a problem now for human beings in South Africa. And if Israel has the technology, you know, or the ideas or some way to try and help and save, you know, save some of the environment, or in terms, certainly in terms of our water systems, surely this is the way of looking at the person that you really think is the other, but actually beginning to speak to each other and realizing that there's actually more, that we actually have something more in common than otherwise. So I think that's hopefully this is hopeful. And just to then really close up, but before we close up, perhaps just to ask if there are any questions, any ideas, any thoughts from anyone who has joined us tonight that they would like to bring. No?
Just to
When you
say,
attend these interfaith conferences or organize them, what are the issues that come to the fore? What are the issues that prevent people from different faiths speaking to one another, understanding one another, tolerating one another's beliefs? Is this because there's a belief that one religion is superior to another and the other one has no right to really exist, that one is the correct faith, and this makes it difficult for people to dialogue with other faiths? Or what is barring that interchange of ideas?
Good question. Thank you, Dan. Peter, would you like to go for it first?
I don't have experience of these interfaith conferences, but I do have experience of, actually quite recently, it seems that there's something within our humanity when we're engaging with someone who's different along religious lines or race lines or social lines, status lines, that we can be quick to erect barriers or put something in the way of relating, perceived or otherwise. And between two people of different religions, it's religious beliefs and conviction, and I believe I'm right, and therefore you must be wrong. And if that's what we hold, well, how do we relate? How do we relate when we have divergent opinions, divergent convictions, divergent ways of seeing the world? And there's, never mind different religions, this could be on different races or different social status. And it's then, I think this is why this discussion is so important. If we are committed to the fundamental concept of we are all one humanity, then there's impetus and really a responsibility to say, I will look you in the eye and see you as me and me as you. I will be curious about your experience and let me hear your stories. But it's not widespread. I work for the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center part-time, and I was at a conference last week in the broader museum sector, and it was fascinating. Every time I introduce myself as Peter from the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center, there's the immediate assumption they say, oh, a Jewish museum. So automatically a box in, and then the second follow-up question without fail was, what's your stance on Palestine? And that was in personal interactions. And also when I presented a paper, one of the questions completely unrelated was, what's your essentially stance on Palestine? And so there is always something that can get in the way of relating. We have to choose, however, to say we're committed to one another because of our perspective that we are on this one earth. We are all children of Adam and Eve too.
Right. Rabbi Yonatan, what your thoughts on the question in terms of an interfaith, from more of the interfaith sector?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I believe that at this moment in history, religious adherents and clergy need to put aside trying to proselytize and to try to get more religious adherents, because we've reached the point where, it doesn't matter how many people of each religion there are on planet Earth if we do ourselves in by trashing and degrading God's creation. It's not like the one with the most religious adherents wins. No, if we all go down on the ship together, then we all go down together. And yet, there's a lot of energy that religious institutions and religious adherents and clergy invest in trying to convince other people to be part of their religion. Now, admittedly, I come from a non-proselytizing religion, which happens to have a very small number of people in it and is very difficult to convert to. But I believe that there, a decision needs to be made. Pope Francis talked about ecological conversion in the sense of converting to an ecological lifestyle. That's what's key at this moment in history. And I would also say that we need to do a peace conversion. We need to convert to embracing peaceful living with each other, because if we come into this narrow place of thinking that the other is a heretic or an infidel, and therefore is worthy of the death penalty. That's such small-mindedness. As one of my teachers, Rabbi Riskin, said, God wants spiritual fruits, not religious nuts. And that's really the challenge for us today. Of how do we pick the fruits in our spiritual traditions, and sort of go beyond the aspects that might lead us to a dark place.
Right. And I think, Rabbi Sachs, again, in his book, Dignity of Difference, I think that's very much part of what he tried to do, which was speak to this point. I'm not sure if Lisa had a question or if someone else had another point or a comment.
I just wanted to say, I think it's a valuable conversation, and I think it's a rallying point for people from all different places to work together to preserve what we have. So I found it valuable to listen to. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So fantastic. Then on that note, I think, the idea of a common future is possible, and maybe even probable, in the sense not only of that we're all in the same boat and on the same planet, and hopefully can we really are here to make the world a better place, as Rabbi Sachs does say. And these are the ways that we can do it together, regardless, perhaps of, as well as emboldened by our beliefs, I think, and the beliefs that bring us together is the way I would say. I don't know if Reverend Peter or Rabbi Yonatan, if you have any last words that you'd like to share with us.
Well, I would just give us a blessing, you know, Shana Tuva Mituka. May we go deep into our ecological tshuva and be able to, you know, enable the next generation to inherit a thriving, spiritually aware, and livable planet. Keni Hiratson.
Amen. Reverend Peter.
I just want to read something from Rabbi Sachs' Power of Ideas when he speaks of the Council of Christians and Jews. He's talking about 9/11 and as appropriate closure, given that it's 9/11 today. He says the day after 9/11, one of our rabbis, the late Leonard Tan, went to the imam of the largest mosque in Birmingham and said, "These will be difficult days for Muslims, and I want you to know that the Jewish community will be standing with you." Birmingham, writes Rabbi Sachs, became a role model of how the leaders of all faiths work together to promote good relations. And that really struck me, to acknowledge the difficult space that we may see another person or another religious group in, and to say, I'm standing with you and I'm standing alongside you. So to say that let's walk across the room, let's walk across the road, let's walk across the city to join hands for the sake of the one planet that we're on.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. An incredible story, and does bring us full circle, I guess. So on that note, I'd like to again thank Reverend Peter, Rabbi Yonatan, for your time and your wisdom, and your just love of the earth and of people, and that really I certainly imbibe. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone.